Thank you so much, Elena, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar and for your time. We'd also like to thank DevelopmentAid for inviting us to share our experiences with you, and we're excited to talk about some of the key success factors to keep in mind when you're managing a digital project. So, as Elena said, my name is Lilianna Bagnoli. I've been working in the development sector for the past 8 years. Most of my background comes at the intersection of social impact, data, technology, and evidence. And in my current role as a project manager at Dimagi, I've worked on around 15 projects across countries, including India, Nepal, Myanmar, and the United States. Some of the projects that I've learned the most from are a large-scale project Dimagi ran in India. We were working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as well as the Central Ministry. And as the scale operations lead, I was responsible for scaling our technology to over 600,000 users across 28 states and 15 languages. The second project I learned a lot from was at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. I led Dimagi's COVID-19 contact tracing and case investigation solution for the city of Philadelphia. And I'll hand over to Dhivya.
Thanks, Lilianna. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Dhivya Sivaramakrishnan, and I am currently working as a project manager at Dimagi. I come with a decade of experience working in the development sector across various domains, including livelihoods and rural migration, financial inclusion, and now focusing on the ICT for D space. In the past 4 years at Dimagi, I have been part of 8+ projects, mostly those with longer durations, centered mostly in India and also in Central Africa, with a prime focus on providing digital solutions on the maternal and child health and community empowerment and wellness programs. I have also had the opportunity to put on various hats in my career, including being a product owner for Dimagi's largest digital scale project in India that Lilianna spoke about, and for the Convergence pilot program in the maternal and child health space, both working with the central ministries. Also led the implementation and training activities for a community engagement program in Uganda with a reputed international NGO, and currently working with the Indian state government on a community empowerment solution. I think of all the roles that I've played, I do love the ones that keep me closer to the field. With that, now let's get set with the agenda. So we all know that project management is a pretty broad but a very important topic with really an unlimited number of project types, sizes, goals, and complexities or constraints that do stare at project managers. At the outset, the key principles of project management, even though those are straightforward and intuitive, but it often leaves us wondering as project managers in terms of, why do some projects succeed while others fail? Why do some projects continue into the future while others end early? What really contributes to a project's dynamic structure, and how do we really tackle it? And what are some project management tools that we might use? So our goal for today's session is to address some of these questions with a 3-layered approach to project management. We'll begin with the general principles of project management, showcasing across the beginning, middle, and the end of a project. Then we layer on top of this foundation with additional considerations for managing a digital project. And finally, to add on, we'll be adding a large-scale, high-complexity project to share some of our learnings about managing these types of projects based on our experience. In order to just ensure this session is made a little interesting and not to set in the monotony, Lilianna and I will be taking turns to walk you through the different facets of project management through an example in our subsequent slides. So we'll also be talking about some success factors, and let's start looking into the key project management principles at the beginning, middle, and end of a project, which I'm sure many of you may be familiar with, but we would just like to cover this briefly here to set the context. So throughout the course of a typical project, project managers often find themselves looking to articulate answers with the hope of attempting to find the right methodologies and tools that would help them navigate through the course of the project successfully. And based on our experience, both Lilianna and I have tried to lay out the key elements of questions that we typically ask ourselves when we go about project management. At the beginning of a project, what we really focused on is understanding what are we really wanting to achieve and what constitutes our scope of work, who all will be involved and what might be their roles and responsibilities, and how will we communicate both internally as well as externally, and how does one focus on stakeholder management. Towards the middle of the project, as we progress, our focus shifts to what kind of methodology will be most appropriate for our project, what are our requirements, have those been finalized, and what might be the end deliverables, are we on track, and what is the best method to monitor the health of our project. Towards the end of a project, we ask ourselves in terms of, okay, so what happens now? Are we prepared to hand over the project? What are our collective learnings as a team? And have some time for retrospectives. Where are we really falling short of, and maybe have takeaways that might inform us for some of our future projects as well as we move forward. So now that we've sort of spoken about key project management principles, let me add another layer of managing projects with a digital component. So at Dimagi, we use this, what we call as a digital solutions lifecycle approach, which most of the project managers use to manage almost all our projects. I will be briefly touching upon each of these aspects to just bring us all on the same page. We begin by defining the contours of a project, which includes crystallizing the goals of the project, finalizing the contract, which may cover broad scope, timelines, budgets, some roles and responsibilities of the stakeholders, and potentially a roadmap. I would now like to draw your attention to steps 2 through 7, from scoping to deployment, which typically consumes high stakes in terms of determining the success of a project. Starting with scoping, which is also the requirements gathering phase. This is the project of discovery, which according to us involves the problems, understanding the problem statement from the point of users, getting in depth of programmatic insights from domain experts. We typically apply user-centric principles in order to focus on high impact, which does add significant value to the requirements that have been provided. Moving on to the system design phase, which is where we see how technology can act as a catalyst in solving a user's problem and design the system architecture and data models. This should, at the end of these 2 steps, culminate into what throws light on the as-is workflows and what might be the to-be workflows. And as we proceed further, this is the stage during which we build a solution, we try to test the solution and iterate this proactively with the users so that we ensure that the system that is being designed for the users is the right one for them. Moving on to the deployment planning phase, where we do think about user provisioning, training and capacity building aspects, and also providing implementation support that may be required to get the solution to our end users. And finally, the last 2 steps that do conclude as part of the middle phase of the project, which is the user acceptance testing and deployment. So before we do deploy the digital solution to a wide set of or a full set of users, we test and get feedback from a representative sample of users to get enough validation of the solution's acceptability. And once we are sure that this really works in the ground without any hiccups that we've come across, we then deploy the solution to our end users. At the end of the project, we support partners in monitoring the application after deployment, collecting feedback continuously from users and other stakeholders, and perhaps also transferring the ownership back to the stakeholders. So as a practice and as a best practice, at the end of each step, it would be important to get a sign-off from partners and document in order to bring in transparency and consistency in our communication.
Thanks, Divya. And before we go any further, I did want to talk about the context that both Divya and I come from as project managers at Dimagi, because this really informs the way that we approach our projects and also some of the tips that we'll be sharing with you today. So something that makes us unique at Dimagi is the way we choose which projects we will work on. And as a software social enterprise, we look for projects that allow us to create high impact as well as high growth. And when I say that, what I mean by high impact is that a project should contribute to the well-being either of the person using our digital solutions or those who are served by the solution. And our technology and our solutions should also be inclusive. On the growth side, we want to make sure we're developing robust solutions. So we like to think that a solution we're building today or maybe over the next 2 years is something that can continue to be used in the long term. And we also want to make sure that our solutions can scale via the market and make sure that we are checking in on those market levers. So we're going to be using a project example when we're talking about project management. And we're going to give you an example of the type of project Dimagi would choose to work on, given its potential to improve health outcomes and to scale via the market. So let's take a look at our example project. And this is the final element of today's presentation, which is to take on a large scale and high complexity project. So let's assume the following about this project. We have a 5-year contract where we're designing a digital solution for immunization in India. And we'd like to design a digital solution that has several components. Let's say the first is a mobile application built on ComCare that will be used by 500,000 health workers across 15 states in 5 languages. So right there we have a high number of users, geographic diversity, and linguistic diversity. We also want to have SMS workflows so that patients can get appointment reminders or confirmations about immunizations. We'll have a web dashboard where government stakeholders can monitor all of the data that's being reported using the mobile application. And then finally, we take all of that data that we've collected and push it to India's health management information systems via a data integration. And then we'll also assume that the project will end after a period of 5 years and that the system should continue running even if we're no longer in the picture, and that we'll be handing over the system to the government. And our key stakeholders for this project will be a funder, so we could think of philanthropy or a large NGO, and then our government stakeholders are present at the central and state level. Regardless of the types of projects you work on, I hope there's something in this example that connects to the work that you do or resonates with your experience so that you can relate to the examples we'll talk about going forward. So let's start at the beginning of this immunization project we just talked about. One thing we need to focus on as project managers is are you able to hear me? Okay. At the beginning of the project, we need to be really conscious of our scope of work. And the scope of work says, what is it that we will do in a project? And importantly, what will we not do? For example, in the project example we shared, we said we would integrate with the health management information system. However, it would be scope creep or something that's out of scope if suddenly our stakeholders wanted us to integrate with another system. Another example of something that's out of scope would be training. So it's clear when we're deploying a solution to 500,000 users that training will be a significant effort that's required, but it's not in our scope of work as the technology provider. And it's important for us to be clear about whose responsibility that is so there aren't misunderstandings later on. At this point in the project, we should also have a shared vision of what success for the project looks like. What are the milestones that we want to reach, and when do we expect to reach them? So for this project, when do we expect to reach 500,000 users? And we should agree on this ahead of time so that when we are meeting those milestones, it's recognized as success and being on track by everybody. The next thing we think about at the beginning of the project are the roles and responsibilities of the internal team as well as the external team. Internally, we should, of course, assess who on our team has the right experience, knowledge, and skills to be able to work on the project. And then externally, we also want to think about what type of decision-making power does each person we're interacting with have. What we've seen in our experience working on large, complex projects is that sometimes it's more difficult than it sounds for one person to be able to sign off on a deliverable and say that we've met the requirements. And knowing ahead of time who can provide that sign off helps you avoid delays in approval or sign off later on in the project. And the final thing we look at the beginning of a project is our stakeholder management approach. And we like to, at Dimagi, like to have a kickoff meeting where everyone who will be involved in the project comes together and we have a transparent conversation about the scope of work and the roles and responsibilities of all of our stakeholders. And we use that meeting as a place to set up recurring meetings that will happen later on in the project with our stakeholders. And so we might agree to have weekly calls if we need to make rapid decisions, or maybe it's a monthly call for stakeholders who are less hands-on. But we should try to define that up front. The other thing that we'll think about here is the capacity of our stakeholders. So in an example like this one, where we're working with government partners, maybe we could have a more effective working relationship if we provide some capacity building on the software development lifecycle that Dhivya spoke about. And by helping them understand the way we work, the entire project health could be improved. Now that we've spoken in general about the beginning of a project, let's put this into numbers and years for our example project. So what you'll see in front of you, of course, is this graph. On the x-axis, we have the 5 years of the project broken up into the beginning, middle, and end phases. And on the y-axis, we have the number of users going all the way up to our 500,000 users that we'd like to reach. And we're focused on year 1, the very beginning of the project. What you'll notice here is that we're not focused on scale in the first year. We're only reaching 10,000 out of 500,000 users. And this is intentional and is informed by our experiences on large scale projects, because a lot of setup has to happen at the beginning of a project. For example, if we're going to host a solution for 500,000 users, the government will likely need to procure infrastructure to be able to support that digital solution. And as we prepare to train 500,000 people, they'll need to find a training partner who's able to go out and lead trainings, and that might even require hiring of human resources. So by thinking through those requirements early on, we can avoid failure points in the project later on. And in year 1, we'd also focus on setting up operational processes that allow us to scale rapidly in subsequent years of the project. So I spoke about the fact that this project will require translation into 5 languages. So how will we translate the solution? Who will be involved? How do we know if the translations are high quality? And how will we translate the training material used for the solution? And if we define those processes early on, then we get to a rapid scale phase, we'll be better equipped. The final thing we'll focus on in year 1 is spending time with our users. And Dhivya spoke about this earlier, that it's very important for us at the beginning of a project to have understood from our users, what is the challenge that we're trying to address with this solution? How will we add value to our users? And for us, that's, we call this our user-centered approach, or human-centered design, where we are doing a process of discovery by interacting with our end users. One thing I'll call out about large-scale projects, if you're working with the government or large foundations, is it can be really tempting, and sometimes there's a lot of pressure to spend most of your time interacting with those stakeholders, when at the end of the day, your end user is a health worker. And we think it's really important to balance time with your very powerful key project stakeholders with your end users, so you get a full picture of what the requirements are.
So as you saw the beginning phase of a particular project, now let's move towards the middle phase of the project. We begin with task execution to ensure project deliverables are handled smoothly. So for a project methodology, we'll begin with that. That really determines how the work is prioritized and completed and how the team will really work together. There is a list of methodologies to choose from, which I'm sure most of you would have used some combination in your projects and might have, experienced whether that really is appropriate for your current project or not. Similarly, in our experience also, we have used what we call as a 2-week sprint in certain large-scale projects. And here, because this is a large, complex project, there may be requirements where we would need to plan and execute this in a very consistent and meticulous fashion. So this is something that may work. In certain rapid development projects, we could also go for an agile methodology. Here, what is important to note is that project management methodologies do make an integral part of any project, as you might know. And when implemented correctly, they can strongly improve the project performance. So it is important to evaluate really the goals and outcome of your project, do a good SWOT analysis of your team members, and also think about the kind of collaboration that is envisaged with the stakeholders, and also the availability of certain tools that would help you in determining the appropriate methodology. The other thing that I would also want to sort of point out here is that selecting sometimes the wrong methodology for our project type and team can be very costly in terms of the training time, the implementation efforts that has gone in, the resources, and also the risks for errors that we might encounter. And this may potentially lead to a poor project performance. So communicating this methodology also externally, not just internally, at the start of this phase helps stakeholders understand how to work with your team and set the right expectations. It is equally important, though, to understand how the stakeholders really function. What is their style of working, who they really are, what works really well with them, what doesn't click. And that all needs to be incorporated into the kind of methodology that you choose for. For example, if the external stakeholder isn't really aware of your sprint planning process, then they might make consistent requests to add in new requirements to the ongoing sprints, which might actually make it very overwhelming and a little frustrating for the team. So the other aspect that I would want to touch about is the project deliverables. It is important to have a point of contact who can really review the work, provide adequate feedback. That may be domain expert, or that might be somebody who is great with technological implementations, and it could also be part of a stakeholder, and also ensure that the sign-offs on deliverables are received from the stakeholders. Typically, through this example of a large-scale project, there should be clear ownership of end products by the partner to avoid confusion about whether the deliverables are acceptable or not. Sometimes it is also important to ensure that a proper quality assessment has been completed of the product design, because you wouldn't want to scale a solution that you're not confident in its quality and standards. And also, as I mentioned previously, we heavily rely on designing user-centric approach, also explained by Lilianna. And the fact that we can leverage traveling on site to meet users and gather feedback is a pretty integral part to how projects at Dimagi function. Finally, project managers should be constantly monitoring the health of the project to assess the progress and identify any risks. A holistic picture of the project, including key accomplishments and risks, should be shared during the regular meeting with stakeholders. As Lilianna mentioned earlier, it is important to understand, what works well with stakeholders. If you would want to have a weekly meeting, communicate via emails, have in-person communication, and so on. It is important to emphasize that right from the start. Also, I think just the last point on the significance of documentation. I think I really can't emphasize enough about how getting timely documentation done could resolve potential risks in a project, especially in large-scale projects and complex projects. It might be overlooked because of urgent deliverables that you might have. It might be also assigned low priority and perhaps also done hastily as we strive to complete the project year on year. But in our experience, documentation must go hand in hand along with system design development across various aspects, such as functional as well as technical documentation. Also having email communication with partners, including those related to approvals or either pushbacks that we might have received. Also with respect to team resourcing and work allocations, financial implications, invoicing, etc. So I'm just sort of pulling out certain critical aspects of documentation, but there might be infinite. It is also important to sort of look at this in terms of knowledge management, both internally as well as externally, because a multi-year project could bring with it, dynamics where team members come in and go out. There are stakeholders who have specific tenures, and they do move to either different departments or to other projects and programs. And it might be really difficult to dig into communication when you are, say, perhaps 3 years down the line, in the middle of the project. Now, as we move forward, looking at the middle phase of our immunization project, so in the previous graph, you saw that we had just begun the multi-year project. Here we are in year 2, where we may shift our focus to project planning and infrastructure to really looking at scale, moving from 10,000 users to 100,000 users. During this time period, we may scale to users who still all speak the same language and perhaps are in the similar geographic areas. After reaching 100,000 users, we would like to intentionally pause onto the scale aspect to assess the project. This is because large-scale projects present to us unique challenges for project managers. There are aspects such as change management, where ensuring that a project achieves its intended results and outcomes by supporting the individual transitions that are required by that project. When you scale a new technology, users may take time to adopt and use it to deliver value. Sometimes they may not be comfortable using a smartphone even. In that aspect, it really takes time for things to evolve. And this is where aspects such as system tuning, gathering feedback, iterating, and testing the product again and again comes into play. Which takes us closer to the project outcomes that we do want to achieve. In our best experience, these are the aspects that have been sort of different between small and medium scale projects to large and complex projects. As a rule of thumb, though, we would definitely need to keep in mind that with a large scale project comes a large impact on the users if we make changes to the system. We should attempt to make these changes as early on in the project as possible to avoid downstream costs. And it is also important at this point to assess any training quality and assessment requirements that you might have in your project. Moving on to year 3, where we'll scale rapidly from 100K to 250K users. Which essentially includes half of our total number of users. In this phase of the project, we'll start adding new languages to the product, which means that we are scaling to newer geographies even. For a complex country like India, where there are different number of states and where people speak different languages, Here we'll continue interacting with as much representation of users as possible and making incremental changes to the system, while being conscious of the fact that large changes would require retraining of the initial set of users who were trained early. I would also want to now move on to the next slide. Move on to year 4, where we'll reach full scale at 500,000 users across 15 states and 5 languages. At this point in time, we would begin thinking about the transition of the system to from Dimagi to the government. So as you saw that there were different phases that were involved in this, complex large-scale project. There are multiple aspects that need to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about, the closure and moving forward in the middle phase of the project. So for this particular project, we'd like to reach full scale in the 4th year. So we have a year to ensure that system stability and sustainability before Dimagi's contract ends. Here, it's important to take note of the regular technology releases that you might do, making sure that information about all the releases, all the changes that have been made to the system reaches not just to the administrators who are monitoring the program, but also reaches the end users so they are aware of what is existing in the application and they might use it effectively. Also, I have emphasized on the importance of documentation, but just one fact that when we are planning the handover and transition from our organization to the external stakeholders, it is important to make sure that all of this is recorded somewhere and also passed on along with certain transition sessions that might have, where the team might get involved in making sure that enough capacity building has been ensured with the stakeholders who are now going to be continuing to adopt the solution and continue to make progress onto the project once it scales.
Okay, so let's move to the final chapter of a project, which is when we're closing out or ending the project. When we're looking at project closeout, there is the first step of closing out your project, which is really related to operations and your project contract, where we're submitting any final reports that we have, our final deliverables, raising our final invoices, and making sure that everything we were responsible for doing has been completed. In the example of the immunization project we spoke about, closing out the project also included a handover of the system to external stakeholders. And at this point, once we've closed out the contract, we've raised our final invoice, this is where project management stops sometimes, but we really believe that it shouldn't stop here and that retrospection and revision of our own project management processes and of our team's work are really important factors in successful project management. So let's look at what happens in the retrospective phase. So in a retrospective, we would be assessing how well did we work together as a team? Did we have the right knowledge that was required for working on this project? Did we use the right processes for managing a project of this scale? Did we make the right decisions about our system architecture and design? And did we need domain experts who could have brought more information to our team, for example, about immunization? During a retrospective, you can, of course, get this information from your internal team, but there's a lot of power in doing a retrospection with your external stakeholders as well. So as a project manager, you could reach out to your partners to ask them, what was your experience like working with my team? Is there anything we could have done better? What have you learned from this process? And that's important for 2 reasons. One, of course, is it can surface critical feedback that you wouldn't have been aware of otherwise, and that's really important input for your team. And the second is that you might get positive feedback that allows you to spotlight the accomplishments of your team and your partner's satisfaction, which could be shared with the rest of your organization or even with other partners. And once we've done a retrospective, the final step is then to use what we've learned and to revise the way that we're working. So for example, with the immunization project, could the team have benefited more from domain knowledge of immunizations? Or should we have had more frequent meetings with our government partners? Is there anything we could have done better when we were at the design phase of the project to communicate to our stakeholders? And in addition to these project-related questions, we might also ask ourselves, is there a hiring need on our team? Possibly there's a new role that we'd like to introduce, and we can work with our hiring manager to open a pipeline. So the end of the project really does allow us to take what we've learned in one project or one experience and translate those learnings and that value to our future projects as well as to our team. So let's come to our project timeline once more and look at the 5th and final year of the project. So here you'll see that we are still at 500,000 users, which we reached at the end of year 4. And at this point, our focus, because of this project, is handing over the system to the government. So we've got 500,000 health workers who are using a CommCare application. Government officials are monitoring data on a dashboard. Patients are receiving SMS messages. And at the end of this year, all of that needs to continue happening. So what do we do in the 5th year of the project? A lot of what we're focused on is making sure that we have confidence in the system and its stability to continue running even if we're no longer in the picture. So this can include, of course, good documentation, as Dhivya spoke about, and a series of handover sessions with a partner where we're training them and building their capacity to take on the work that we've done. And we also want to document key learnings as a part of this phase of the project to be able to wrap up our work at the end of the 5th year. So I want to end our presentation today with some closing thoughts about success with managing digital projects. And my first thought is to plan ahead by project phase. So each phase of a project, as we saw when we divided the project into 5 years, will have its own unique challenges, learning opportunities, and requirements. And as project managers, the value we add is to constantly be thinking ahead to that next question of what is it that we need to accomplish in the next project phase and align all of our stakeholders on the priorities for the upcoming phases. We also need to think ahead by project phase on what training or capacity building will be required to get us ready for that next phase of the project. And as we move from phase to phase of the project, how are we managing change on the project? To call out an example from the immunization project we saw, how are we handling changes to our digital solution over time? If we need to make a really big change to our software, how are we going to get that information out to users who will communicate it? And how do we make sure that that's presented to users in a way that's understandable? The second takeaway is for us to communicate our priorities transparently. So working with the internal team, we can assume that your internal team will be aligned on what you're working on and what your priorities are and your timelines. Sometimes we don't include our external stakeholders as often as we should in communicating what a priority might be. And making sure that you have those recurring meetings, check-ins, appropriate sign-offs are a way to align all of the stakeholders on the project on a shared vision as well as expectations for the project. The other type of priority to communicate is how your priority changes when you're transitioning between project phases. And you heard us speak about this in the example. In year 1 of the project, we're focused on building processes and scalable systems. In the middle of the project, we're focused on achieving actual scale, rolling out the system to new geographies and languages. At the end, we're focusing on stability and handover. So making sure that our partners are aware of the priority of each project phase can help us all move together smoothly on the same project timeline. And the final takeaway is specific to the large-scale projects that we spoke about. So, of course, projects will differ, but in general, we think it's important to balance your scale with your stability of the project. And what we mean by that is allow time in between your scaling phases of the project to seek feedback from users and from stakeholders, while you're still more flexible about being able to make changes to a system and build your confidence that as you continue to scale further, the system will add value, people will continue to use the system, you won't have a lot of drop off from your users. And the final thing is that by balancing scale and stability, we're able to prepare for future scale. So if we know that at 100,000 users or 250,000 users, we're confident about the way the system has been configured, we will be more prepared to move into the next phase of scaling a project. Thank you all for your time. We really appreciate it and welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Liliana and Divya, for sharing this interesting information and your experience with us. We do have some questions from the audience. So first question is, Stella is asking how digital transformation can be complex sometimes. So how can we simplify the process, or how can we make sure that the process is not that complex in the end?
Thanks, Elena. I can take that question. I think we definitely agree. Being in the digital space, digital transformation can be very complex, especially in low and middle income countries where the adoption of technology isn't as much as you might have noticed in some of the other countries. Based on our experience, I think what really helps sort of simplify this process, although not completely, but some of the things that do go into this is to be able to select projects that do resonate and might see an importance of digital usage, and having the digital tool and aid become a catalyst in that solution. I think it's also important to have the ability to be able to convince the stakeholders and partners and also move them into the direction of digital transformation. In our experience, what we've really seen is that there are piles and piles of paperwork. There is a lot of manual effort that goes into documenting the field processes, or even passing on the data from one hierarchy to another hierarchy, which really involves a lot of time investment, a lot of resources, and also financial implications. What this can really help resolve is if a digital aid or tool is involved into this process and woven into the way that they typically work. So not really disrupting their processes, because that might be too much of a change. How might we think of ways in which we can integrate a digital solution in the ways of their own working without really hampering the end goal for them, which essentially also means that amplifying their outcomes that they do want to achieve. I think customer experience is also really important to ensure, taking both the end users as well as the administrators who run the program both hand in hand. I think it's easier for us to perhaps have conversations on digital transformation with the administrators, but may not be so much with the actual users. But if we do focus on understanding what is the problem that they are solving at different levels, without really jumping into conclusions as to, oh, this solution really might work according to me, without really staring at the problem enough, I think can lead to building in solutions that might not be perfect for the problems that they are facing. And also taking this back to the stakeholders multiple number of times to make sure that we've got it right. I think that is another important aspect that I would want to sort of highlight. And finally, I think it's also sort of talking about the culture and leadership of digital transformation, making sure that when we do engage with stakeholders, where we ideate on solutions, we speak with our experience based on the kind of impact that we might have created based on some of the previous projects that we have executed and implemented in the past, or taking examples of some of the issues that are currently staring at the world. So, for example, diving deep into a COVID solution may have been something that a lot of organizations did think through, but maybe doing it the right way, when it really clicks and is taken to fruition, is important by looking at certain aspects that we just spoke about. So I think that these are some of the, of course, there are a lot that goes into digital transformation.
For sure.
And I might have covered all of this, but these are a couple of points that I would want to.
Okay. Also, I'll be interested as well to understand or how do we make sure that we don't fall back into those old habits and we do make sure that we actually move forward and we transform.
I can jump in for this one. So I'll speak to the type of work we do at Dimagi, which involves moving from paper-based systems to digital systems. So our transformation is quite literally from paper to digital. And a really typical use case is that we might work with a cadre of community health workers who are using paper registers to record information about the services they're providing and digitize those workflows and then replace the paper in theory with an application. That's really tough to actually fully replace paper. And it requires a change in behavior. And I think about myself and knowing that I live in New Delhi and the air quality is poor and I should wear a mask when I go outside. And even I don't change my behavior always when I know I should. So behavior change is hard. And we're trying to accomplish a shift in how people do their entire day of work from paper to digital tools. So I think there are a few ways we can, as digital implementers, try to make sure we don't fall back into our old patterns. And one is just to focus really hard on understanding how things work currently. So one thing we've seen in our role at Dimagi is that if we are hired or contracted by a funder to build a digital system, they also have some ideas about how things are currently happening on paper. They might think they know the entire workflow of what a community health worker does. And when Dimagi visits the field and we interact with health workers and shadow their daily activities, we find that there is a gap between what should be happening on paper, according to paper, and what's happening in real life. And if we're designing a digital solution for that transformation, we should be addressing all of the needs of the end user or the health worker, and not just those that are obvious based on how a current stakeholder thinks it'll work. So one is just to get your design right. And I think the other is flexibility to update your system as you move forward. So we talked a lot in our presentation about the risk of making changes to a system once you're at large scale because of the impact it has on users. There's another risk on the other end of the spectrum where you could be adding new value to your users by listening to the feedback that they have and making incremental changes and addressing emerging needs. For example, the pandemic brought several new needs, and we should keep listening to what users require and show that flexibility to update a system. Otherwise, it's much easier to customize a piece of paper for me as a health worker than it is to customize this digital solution.
I see. Thanks, Lilianna. Now that you've mentioned as well about the pandemic, I'm sure that period brought a lot of challenges. So would you be able to share with us what are the top 3 challenges from your experience that a digital project can face?
I can start answering, and maybe Lindsay can add
Sure.
to this. So I think one of the challenges in my experience that I've really come across is to be able to get the requirements on time, accurately for a particular project. We've had experience working with different kinds of stakeholders who have different working styles and also on different problem statements. Sometimes, especially in the post-pandemic world, where traveling to locations where the users are currently working has become a challenge. I think it is definitely becoming challenging for us to really shadow the users, try and be with them to understand their daily lives, understand what is really going into their daily job routine, because that actually forms a core of the requirements gathering process that we embark on at Dimagi. While we do get a lot of requirements from the stakeholders at the administrative level and higher hierarchies, where they think that this is how the policy has been designed, or a program is being implemented or is envisaged to be implemented, these are the list of things that should go into designing a digital solution. But our real validation is when we actually hit the field and try and see if to what extent is that something that is covering the real problem that the end users are facing, because ultimately they are the ones who are going to be using, say for example, a mobile application. I think we've also seen that requirements gathering does flow in even in the subsequent phases of the project. So like we spoke about our digital lifecycle solution, where scoping and requirement gathering is the initial phase, we do see that it sort of creeps in even towards the subsequent phases, and to be able to contain that in a manner that either we take that as a feedback, include it, but also be cognizant of the fact that because there might be implications on training and other aspects, or not having the flexibility to incorporate some of that because of the implications, and having to explain that to the stakeholders, all sort of fits into the same gamut. I think that's one. The other is also the other challenge that we typically face is also in terms of documenting the proceedings of a project. Sometimes because there is a lot of emphasis on getting things done through a solution, and what that really leaves less time for us to be able to document things on time, whether those are functional documentation, technical documentation. And while we may take the time, and this is something that we've seen a change, at least in our organization, over the years, where a lot of emphasis has been pointed towards the documentation to make sure that that goes hand in hand with the project development. But the same reciprocation also needs to come in from the other stakeholders that are part of the project typically. And so typically, if you see, documentation can manifest in different aspects, not just making a note of the different changes that have gone into the solution, for example, but it might also be with respect to sign-offs or approvals, which is important for us to have on time, so that we can have that as a foolproof mechanism to move forward. Lilianna, do you want to add at this point?
That was great. Thanks, Divya.
Okay, before we will take the last question from Donna, I would like to remind our attendees that we will be running, or I'll be running the last poll. Just give me a second. And okay, so the last question was, what aspects of designing should be kept in mind to improve as an adoption of digital tool by the end users?
I'm happy to jump in on that. There are so many things to keep in mind. The one that I would focus on is, especially for the types of end users Dimagi designs for, frontline workers, when you have a digital system, it can be tempting to add more and more questions and content to a solution. And I think if you want good uptake of your solution and for people to like interacting with your solution, being mindful of that end user's time at the end of the day and what it requires of them to use your solution, and making sure that you are adding value by streamlining their work is something for us to keep in mind. And I would caution other organizations working at the intersection of development and technology to really think about the requirements that are coming specifically for a program or to support a community health worker or another frontline worker versus those that are add-ons because they're nice to have and just because we can. So I think respecting the time of the end user is something I would suggest.
Okay, actually we've got one more question here that I think it's important as well to cover. So the level of detail for digital project is unprecedented. So when you design anything, you talk about everything from strategy to where a play button will be placed on the website. Would you have any recommendations for project management software or any specific methods?
I can maybe add to this. So one of the project management tools that we do use at Dimagi is Asana. Asana management tool is specifically for project managers and also for the team to sort of this allows the project managers to be able to completely sort of draw a roadmap of the project from start to end, be able to assign tasks to different team members and also track the progress of the tasks time to time. It also enables, to share documents across for feedback, allows you to, mark dependencies for different steps of the project maybe, and also is sort of a comprehensive tool that allows you to see the timeline of the project and how it's really progressing. This is something that we do share with different teams across different projects that we work with, and it can be sort of categorized and worked upon in a way that it sort of suits the needs of your project. But this has been one tool for us to go to. And in terms of system design, because I think that was part of the question, I think it is really important for us to map the needs of the users to what really makes sense in terms of the UI of the solution itself. So whether it's a web application or tool or it's a mobile aid, I think it's very important to understand the psyche of the user in terms of what might really make sense, what's really intuitive for the users, and all of that is actually part of the system design phase that we spoke about, and that also is detailed through workflows that we do draw out when we gather the requirements. So one of the tools that we do use is to chart out everything in a workflow fashion with the use of various tools, and we sort of see if the workflows that we did come across as part of our observation to what we are going to design as part of the system, how do those both compare in terms of design, and if that is something that really helps solve the solution for the problem, which you might have to break into smaller chunks to be able to design effectively. I think this is also something that helps in terms of just drawing out the workflow maps.
Okay, thanks a lot. And before we will wrap up, I would like to thank again Lilianna and Dhivya for joining us today and for providing such a comprehensive and interesting presentation. Also, taking this opportunity, I invite you to take a look at our business development and recruitment tools that we've specifically designed to assist individual experts, but as well organizations in landing projects funded by the international donors. Also, if you have any questions or maybe comments for this or for our future events, please don't hesitate to send me a message. And I look forward to welcome you to our next webinars. Thanks a lot, ladies. If you have any last comments before we close the event.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you all for your time and having us here.
Thanks again, ladies, and have a good evening and goodbye.